It's April 16th, 1746, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Culloden Moor, just outside Inverness, Scotland. The temperature has dropped to freezing. Rain lashes horizontally across an open plateau. And standing there, surrounded by 5,000 Highland warriors, is a young man who's about to witness something that will reshape a nation forever. The bagpipes are wailing. The clans are ready. And in the next 60 minutes, roughly 1,500 people are going to die on this muddy moorland. But what happened after? That's almost worse. Here's the situation. On one side, you've got 5,000 Highland warriors. Most of them have just marched 500 miles south and back again. Barefoot, starving, exhausted. Their supply lines have collapsed. Morale is fractured. Some haven't eaten properly in days. On the other side, 9,000 British regulars. Well-fed, well-equipped, disciplined. These are soldiers who've never lost a pitched battle in their entire military history. They've got artillery. They've got cavalry. They've got something the Highlanders have never faced before. And they know it. The odds aren't just bad. They're mathematically impossible. And yet thousands of these Highland warriors are about to charge directly into cannon fire anyway. Not because they think they can win, but because they've got nothing left to lose. But here's what almost nobody talks about. This wasn't just a military defeat. This was cultural annihilation dressed up as a military victory. Within 2 years, an entire way of life that had existed for 500 years would be systematically destroyed by law. Banned. Erased. And the strangest part? The official records from that day are so full of gaps and inconsistencies that we're still finding new evidence about what actually happened. In 2019, archaeologists excavated mass burial pits that had been hidden for over 250 years. What they found inside rewrites everything we thought we knew about Culloden. Bodies stacked in ways that suggest things happened on that moor that were never written into the history books. Executions that were erased. Soldiers that literally vanished from military records for 40 years. Evidence that the British Army's official casualty count was, let's just say, incomplete. Today we're diving into the real story of Culloden. Not the cleaned-up version you'll find in most textbooks. The actual tactical errors that sealed the Jacobites' fate in real time. The archaeological evidence that's only now revealing what really happened. Why this 90-minute battle ended an entire culture. The mysterious aftermath. The executions that didn't make it into official records. How 3,000 soldiers vanished from the British Army's accounts. And the 2019 discovery that changes everything about what we thought we knew about the casualties. This is military history. This is culture clash. This is the moment when the old world collided with the new one, and one of them didn't survive. Stick around because, by the end of this, you're going to understand why April 16th, 1746 didn't just change Scotland. It changed the trajectory of the entire British Empire. And more importantly, you're going to see why historians are still arguing about what really happened that day. To understand why 5,000 desperate men would charge into cannon fire, you first need to understand what they were fighting for. And that story starts not in 1746, but 40 years earlier, in 1707. Imagine you're a Scottish Highland chief. Your family has ruled these mountains for 5 centuries. Your power comes from loyalty, from clansmen who follow you because of blood, because of history, because of honor. Your wealth comes from cattle. Your authority comes from the land you control and the disputes you settle. This system has worked for 500 years. It's ancient. It's sacred. Then in 1707, everything changes. England and Scotland unite. On paper, it's a partnership. In reality, it's London taking control. And from London's perspective, the Highland clan system isn't quaint tradition. It's a problem. It's a threat. Here's the fundamental disconnect. Highland culture is tribal, honor-based, kinship-driven. Every decision flows through personal relationships and ancestral loyalty. But British governance? It's bureaucratic. It's mercantile. It's centralized around Parliament and commercial interests. These two systems cannot coexist, and London knows it. The first real test comes in 1715. a Jacobite rebellion, followers of the James line seeking Catholic restoration to the throne. It fails, but it proves the threat is real. There are Highlanders willing to rebel. There are clans that will take up arms against the crown. And London is terrified. So for the next 30 years, the British government tightens the screws. They station troops in the Highlands. They try to regulate cattle trade. They make it illegal to carry weapons in traditional Highland fashion. They ban the teaching of Gaelic. It's not dramatic. It's death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. By 1745, the Highlanders can feel the noose tightening. The old ways are being systematically criminalized. The clan system is being dismantled piece by piece through legislation. And then, suddenly, a way out appears. Enter Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, 24 years old, charismatic, representing something the Highlands see as their last chance. A Catholic Stuart restoration, a return to the old order, a way to reclaim what's being stolen. But here's the critical thing most history books gloss over. Charles makes promises he can't keep. He tells clan leaders that French military support is coming. It never materializes. He convinces experienced commanders that this rebellion can work. They have doubts, but Charles is persuasive. He's desperate, and the clans are desperate too. So in August 1745, it starts. Maybe 200 men initially. By Edinburgh, there are 3,000. The capital falls into Jacobite hands. For a moment, it feels possible. It feels like maybe, just maybe, the Highlands can reclaim their future. Then Charles makes a fatal decision. He marches south into England. Even his most experienced commanders object. The supply lines are stretching. The men are getting hungry. But Charles pushes forward. They reach Derby, only 125 miles from London, before turning back. That retreat? That's the moment morale shatters. The men realize this isn't going to work. But we can't just talk about strategy and politics, because these weren't abstract soldiers. They were specific people with names and families. Clan chiefs like the Camerons of Lochiel, the MacDonalds, the Chisholms. Some were manipulated into joining. Others genuinely believed in the cause. Many Highland soldiers were farmers who abandoned their fields during planting season. Their families were vulnerable back home. They weren't ideological rebels. They were fathers and brothers trying to protect their way of life. That's the emotional reality underneath all the military strategy. By spring 1746, the army is fractured, divided between those wanting to retreat to the Highlands and those wanting to fight. Desperately short of supplies, morale collapsing. About 1,000 to 2,000 men have deserted. Despite everything, clan leaders feel honor-bound to continue. They've committed. Their men are committed. To turn back now would be to abandon the cause and face execution anyway. So on April 16, 1746, they march to Culloden moor. Not because they think they can win, but because they've run out of alternatives. The British are closing in. The cause is dying. And sometimes when you've got nothing left to lose, you fight anyway. And what happens next will prove that sometimes the most devastating defeats aren't just military. They're existential. April 16, 1746, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Culloden moor sits about 300 feet above sea level, just outside Inverness. It's a plateau, open, exposed, no trees, no cover, no hills to duck behind. Just mud. And the conditions on this particular day? They're absolutely terrible. The temperature is hovering around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. There's been rain overnight, so the ground is waterlogged. Not muddy in the way you might imagine, but truly saturated. Each step sinks. The earth squelches beneath your boots. And the wind? It's gusting between 15 and 20 miles per hour, pushing rain sideways. The mist is thick enough that you can't see more than a few hundred yards in any direction. Now, you might be thinking, why does the weather matter? Here's why. This is the absolute worst possible ground for Highland warriors. See, the traditional Highland fighting style depends on surprise, close-quarters devastation, and psychological shock. You want rough terrain where you can hide. You want narrow passes where you can ambush. You want to use the landscape against your enemy. But Culloden Moor? There's nowhere to hide, nowhere to flank, nowhere to use your advantages. It's a flat, open killing field. And that's not an accident. The British general, the Duke of Cumberland, he's 24 years old, but he's not stupid. He positioned his army on terrain where modern warfare advantages him completely. And Highland traditional warfare advantages him not at all. So let's talk about what's actually on this moor. The Jacobite force is approximately 5,000 to 7,000 strong. Sources disagree, which is part of why this gets complicated later. On their right flank, you've got the Clan Donald regiments. This is significant because in Highland tradition, the right flank gets the place of honor. But here's where it gets interesting. There's apparently been some dispute about positioning that day. Some accounts suggest the MacDonalds were placed on the left flank instead. A tremendous insult. That internal resentment? It's going to matter in about 20 minutes. Center and left, Cameron clansmen, Stuart clansmen, McIntosh, and Northern clans. They've got about 12 cannons, most of them unmounted or poorly maintained. They've got minimal cavalry, and their officers? Mostly experienced in traditional Highland warfare. They understand clan combat. They understand ambush tactics. But pitched, open-field battles against disciplined European armies? That's not their expertise. The British force is approximately 9,000 troops. They've got regiments like the Royal Scots, English regulars, soldiers who've been trained in European warfare. They've got about 10 cannons, but here's the critical difference. Their gun crews are superbly trained. We're talking about artillery that's been perfected over decades of European conflicts. And they've got about 500 cavalry, mounted on good horses, experienced and well-equipped. Leading them is the Duke of Cumberland, George William Frederick. He's young, but he's combat experienced from European campaigns. He understands how to integrate artillery with infantry. He understands linear formations and disciplined volleys. And he's been given essentially unlimited authority to crush not just an army, but an entire way of life. The math is brutal. The British have numerical superiority. They have superior equipment. They have superior training for this specific type of warfare. And they have terrain that favors their advantages completely. But here's where the real story starts. The night before the battle, Lord George Murray, the experienced Highland general, wants to retreat. He's not being cowardly. He's being strategic. He knows Culloden Moor is a death trap. He knows the Highlands are terrain where guerrilla warfare could work for years. He knows this pitched battle is mathematically unwinnable. But Charles Edward Stuart overrules him. And that single decision? That determines the outcome right there. Charles wants a battle. So there will be a battle. It gets worse. That same night, the Jacobites attempt a night raid on the British camp. It's supposed to catch the British off guard, disrupt their positions. It fails spectacularly. Men get lost in the mist. The element of surprise is lost. The Jacobite soldiers trudge back to their positions, exhausted, cold, hungry, and demoralized. So when the battle actually starts, the Jacobite army is already fractured. They haven't slept. They haven't eaten. Morale is collapsing before a shot is fired. This isn't a fighting force anymore. It's desperate men who've been ordered to hold position and wait. At 1 p.m. exactly, the British artillery opens fire. The cannons are positioned at maximum effective range, about 600 yards away. And the gun crews know what they're doing. They've calculated the distance. They've accounted for wind. And now they're lobbing iron balls into a mass of 5,000 men with nowhere to run. Picture this for a second. You're a Highland warrior. You've trained your whole life for close combat. You know how to handle a sword. You know how to charge. You know how to fight man to man. But you've never trained for this. No one has. A cannonball the size of a man's fist comes screaming through the air at 200 feet per second. When it hits a group of tightly packed soldiers, it doesn't just kill one person. It kills or catastrophically injures 3, 4, sometimes 5 men. It tears limbs off. It shatters bones. And there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. According to eyewitness accounts from survivors, the cannon fire tore through ranks like butcher's knives. One round, then another, then another. For about 15 minutes, the British artillery pounds the Jacobite lines while the Highlanders stand there, unable to retaliate effectively, watching their comrades literally torn apart. The psychological impact is devastating. This is a type of warfare the Highland warriors have never experienced. This is industrial-age combat, and they're facing it with swords and shields. The officers are screaming orders. The pipers are playing to keep morale up. But morale is collapsing anyway. Then, unable to bear the artillery bombardment any longer, the clan leaders make the decision. Charge. Approximately 2,000 to 3,000 warriors. Exact numbers are disputed because records were incomplete. Start running across that muddy moor. They're screaming. They're waving broadswords and dirks. Many are barefoot. The bagpipes are wailing. It's chaos and fury, and centuries of tradition compressed into a desperate assault. From the British perspective, this is exactly what they want. This is exactly what they've trained for. As the Highland charge closes, the British infantry, standing in disciplined ranks, opens fire. First volley at about 80 yards. Second volley at 60 yards. Third volley at 40 yards. The soldiers are trained to reload and fire in coordinated volleys. Men fall. The charge continues. More volleys. More men fall. And then, the critical moment, the Highlanders reach close range, about 30 yards. This is where they should dominate. This is close quarters combat, where the sword beats the musket. This is where their training matters. But the British have an answer. Socket bayonets. Long bayonets affixed to the ends of their muskets. As the Highlanders close, the British soldiers drop their muskets and use them like spears. They're holding formation. They're disciplined. And they're turning their guns into 6-foot-long pikes. The Highland charge crashes into a wall of bayonets, and it breaks. The left flank, possibly still resentful about the positioning dispute, doesn't fully commit to the assault. The center holds for maybe a minute. Then it shatters. British cavalry begins pursuing the fleeing warriors. Some organized resistance continues until about 1:45 p.m. The entire battle lasts approximately 60 minutes. From artillery opening fire to complete collapse, 1 hour. Here's where it gets complicated. Official records state approximately 50 to 100 British soldiers died. The exact number was never formally documented. Jacobite casualties are estimated between 1,200 and 1,500. But that number varies wildly depending on the source. But here's the problem. The British Army records from that day are oddly vague. We know their exact artillery expenditure. They fired 1,847 cannon rounds. We know initial soldier counts. We know provisioning details. But the actual casualty records? Missing for decades. Why would detailed military records just vanish? And the Highland accounts? Many survivors reported that British casualty numbers were far higher than the official 50-100. Some eyewitness accounts suggest 200 to 300 British deaths. If that's true, why does the official record show so few? The battle is over. The Highlanders have lost. But the real horror is just beginning, because the British didn't come to Culloden to win a battle. They came to end a culture. And what happens in the hours and days after this 60-minute fight will prove it. By 4 p.m. that same day, the mist had thickened across Culloden moor. Approximately 1,500 bodies lay scattered across the waterlogged ground, many of them in pools of water and blood mixing together in the rain. The battle was over. The slaughter had begun. What happened next is where this story gets dark. Really dark. British soldiers were given explicit orders. Execute the wounded. Not capture them. Not treat them. Execute them. And this wasn't some aberration. This was policy. The Duke of Cumberland had given his men essentially unlimited authority to finish anyone still alive on that battlefield. This continued for 3 days. 3 full days of soldiers moving through the moor, bayoneting wounded Highlanders where they lay. The official British Army records document approximately 120 executions. But here's where the archaeology changes everything. In 2019, Professor Tony Pollard from the University of Glasgow led an excavation of mass burial pits on the battlefield. What he found was skeletal evidence, bone fragments, positioning, burial patterns that suggested the actual number of executed wounded was probably closer to 400 to 600 people, maybe more. Think about what that means. The British military kept meticulous records of everything: ammunition expenditure, soldier counts, provisions. But somehow the execution numbers just don't match up. Either record-keeping was catastrophically bad, or someone deliberately minimized the official count. Given how detailed British military records were in every other area, you can probably guess which explanation is more likely. By April 17th, the hunt began. The Duke of Cumberland had absolute orders: find every rebel. No exceptions, no mercy. The government appointed military commanders to specific regions throughout the Highlands. These weren't peacekeeping forces. These were occupation troops. They had unlimited authority and essentially zero oversight. What they did in those remote glens wouldn't be documented, and nobody was going to contradict them. The strategy was simple but brutal. Any Highlander found alive was assumed to be a rebel. Any shelter provided to a fugitive meant execution. Any food given to someone fleeing meant execution. The British military was going to hunt down every single person involved in the rebellion, and they were going to do it systematically. For 5 months, Charles Edward Stuart became the most wanted man in Britain. There was a price on his head, £30,000, which in modern money is roughly equivalent to $5 million today. Imagine that, an amount of money that would set someone up for life. A price that could transform an ordinary person into a wealthy landowner. And yet, for 5 months, Charles was hidden in the Scottish Highlands, moving from glen to glen, from sympathizer to sympathizer. Here's where it gets interesting. Hundreds of Highland people knew exactly where he was. Multiple times, he was hidden in places where locals could easily betray him to the British. Any single person could have collected that enormous reward. They just didn't. Why? There are written accounts from people who sheltered him. Most of them were families of soldiers who died at Culloden. One account describes a widow whose husband had been killed on the moor. When Charles was brought to her door, dying, starving, she sheltered him for weeks. When asked why, knowing the danger, knowing the reward, knowing she could have ended the hunt, she said, "I couldn't betray someone my husband died trying to defend." That tells you something about what Culloden meant to people. It wasn't abstract rebellion. It was personal. It was about families, about honor, about the kind of loyalty that transcends rational economic calculation. But the British were relentless. Between 1746 and 1748, approximately 120 rebels were put on trial. The documentation exists for maybe 40 of them. The rest? Vague references. Death records, but no trial records. Some sources suggest summary executions. Trials that happened in days, sometimes hours, with guilty verdicts delivered almost automatically. Take Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat. He was 80 years old when they tried him. He was also the last person to be formally decapitated in Britain. An execution in 1747 that was deliberately theatrical, designed to send a message to the Highlands. His trial was public. His death was public. Everything about Lord Lovat was meant to be a warning. But hundreds of others weren't named. They weren't documented. Scottish record keepers in the regional archives found executions mentioned in local records that simply don't appear in the official British military records. When historians have tried to cross-reference names and dates between Scottish archives and British records, they discover systematic gaps. People who definitely died, but whose deaths aren't recorded in the official account. Beyond the executions, there was transportation. About 600 to 700 rebels were convicted, and instead of hanging, they were transported to the American colonies, primarily North Carolina and Virginia. This sounds merciful until you realize what it actually meant. These people were forcibly exiled from their homeland, loaded onto prison hulks, floating prison ships, and shipped across the Atlantic. Some of them died during the journey. Malnutrition, disease. The conditions were brutal. Here's the problem. Only about 300 of them are documented in colonial records. What happened to the other 200 to 400 transportees? The theories range from dying on prison hulks to being sold into private indentured servitude contracts. One theory suggests they were dispersed across multiple colonial destinations and simply lost to historical record. Another suggests deliberate erasure, records destroyed to hide the actual mortality rates during transportation. This discrepancy, this gap between the people transported and the people documented, is part of what makes modern historians so uncertain about the exact numbers. The official narrative has holes in it. Big holes. And then came the systematic destruction of Highland culture itself. Within months of Culloden, Parliament passed laws designed to make sure a Highland rebellion could never happen again. July 1746, the Act of Proscription. It banned Highland dress. It banned bagpipes. It banned Gaelic language instruction. Not outright at first. That would be too obvious. But through a system of fines and restrictions that made these things effectively illegal. Clan chiefs were stripped of their hereditary judicial powers. Fortified castles were garrisoned by British troops. Feudal duties were abolished, which sounds progressive on paper, but it was designed specifically to eliminate the system that held clans together. The British government was explicit about this in their internal documents. We must crush the remnants of the Highland system. This wasn't just winning a battle. This was cultural erasure through legislation. And the Highland people understood exactly what was happening. They could feel their entire world being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, law by law. By 1750, the Highlands were under military occupation. By 1760, laws had been rewritten to ensure the clan system could never resurge. The transformation from traditional feudal clan-based society to integrated British subject population happened in a single generation. It was rapid, it was brutal, and it was almost completely deliberate. But here's what's fascinating, and what many history books completely miss. The official narrative doesn't quite match what historians are finding in the ground. The casualty numbers don't add up. The trial records have unexplained gaps. The transportation records are incomplete. And the executed prisoners? The burial evidence suggests far more people died than anyone was willing to officially acknowledge. The core mystery of Culloden starts with a very simple question. How many people actually died that day? The official British accounts say approximately 50 to 100 British soldiers. Highland casualty estimates range from 1 to 200 to 1 to 500. But here's the problem. Those British numbers are extremely vague in the official military records. We have incredibly detailed documentation of ammunition expenditure. 1,847 cannon rounds were fired. We have soldier counts. We have logistics records. But the actual casualty counts? Oddly sparse. Just rough estimates. No names, no units, no systematic accounting. Contemporary Highland accounts from survivors suggest the British casualty numbers were much higher. Some eyewitness descriptions hint at 200 to 300 British deaths, possibly more. If that's accurate, why would the official records show so few? Here's where the 2019 excavation becomes critical. Professor Tony Pollard from the University of Glasgow and the Culloden Battlefield Trust conducted systematic archaeological surveys of mass burial pits on the moor. What they found was bone evidence, fragments, skeletal arrangements, trauma patterns consistent with cannon injuries and bayonet wounds. The bone evidence suggested approximately 300 to 400 bodies in those mass graves. Many of them showed evidence of being shot from behind while fleeing. Pursuit deaths, not battlefield deaths. They showed signs of execution-style killings. And here's the critical part. Many of these skeletal remains were consistent with British soldier physiology and uniform materials found at the burial sites. Why would British soldiers be in mass burial pits? The official narrative says they were buried respectfully by local people afterward. But the skeletal evidence tells a different story. The bones show hasty burial. Multiple bodies stacked without ceremony. Weapons still nearby. This looks less like respectful burial and more like covering up evidence. This leads to theory number 1, the cover-up hypothesis. Some historians argue the British casualty numbers were deliberately minimized for propaganda purposes. Think about it strategically. If 1,500 Highlanders died but 300-plus British soldiers also died, the battle suddenly looks less like a dominant military victory. It looks more like a costly engagement, where the British just had superior numbers and coordination. A battle where you lose 300 soldiers and kill 1,500 enemies still looks good. A battle where you lose maybe 50 soldiers and kill 1,500 enemies? That's a massacre. That's overwhelming dominance. That's the kind of decisive victory that justifies everything that comes after. If the true casualty count was significantly higher on the British side, it would undermine the narrative of British superiority. And the British needed that narrative. They needed to show that British military discipline and modern warfare tactics were so vastly superior to Highland traditional warfare that there was really no comparison. That narrative justified not just the battle, but everything that came after. The occupation, the cultural suppression, the forced displacement. But there's a problem with the cover-up hypothesis. If the British were consciously minimizing casualty numbers, where would they hide 200-plus soldiers? These aren't abstract numbers. These are real men with names, units, families. You can't just make them disappear from military records without someone noticing, unless the records were genuinely incomplete. Which brings us to theory number 2, the documentation failure theory. This is actually less sinister. It's just possible that in the chaos of the aftermath, soldiers pursuing fugitives, units scattered, medical services overwhelmed. The British Army simply never recorded complete casualty figures. But here's what makes that hard to believe. 18th century British military administration was actually incredibly thorough in most areas. They had systems. They had record keepers. They kept detailed logs of provisions, ammunition, movement. It's odd that casualty records would be the one area where documentation suddenly became vague. Then there's the execution question. The British recorded approximately 120 executions of wounded soldiers on the field. But the burial evidence suggests maybe 400 to 600. That's a discrepancy of 300 to 500 bodies. Those aren't rounding errors. Those are entire companies of soldiers. The question is, why the discrepancy? Did the British soldiers on the ground execute more wounded than were officially recorded? Were they told to execute everyone and just did it? Were those executions deliberately underreported because higher command wanted to minimize the appearance of brutality? Or, and this is speculation, but it's worth considering, did local Highlanders who found wounded soldiers after the British withdrew do some of that execution themselves? Revenge killings against the soldiers who'd just slaughtered their friends and family members? Some bodies in those mass pits show what could be sword wounds or dirk wounds, wounds consistent with Highland weapons, not just British bayonets. If that's true, it would explain the documentation gap. The British wouldn't record executions they didn't commit, and the casualty numbers would be incomplete because they only reflected British soldiers found by British recovery teams, not those found by local Highlanders seeking revenge. This leads to the transportation mystery. Approximately 600 to 700 rebels were convicted and transported to the American colonies instead of being executed. This sounds merciful in theory. In practice, transportation was essentially a death sentence delayed. Prison hulks were floating nightmare vessels with disease, starvation, brutality. Many prisoners died during the voyage. But here's the thing. Only about 300 of the transported prisoners are documented in colonial records. What happened to the other 200 to 400? Did they die on the prison hulks? Were records lost? Were they sold into private servitude contracts that erased their identities? There are North Carolina and Virginia plantation records that reference Scottish prisoners and Jacobite transports. But the names don't always match up with the British transportation records. It's possible that different naming systems, different record-keeping standards, and scattered documentation make cross-referencing nearly impossible. But it's also possible that people were deliberately dispersed and documentation was intentionally obscured. One specific discovery adds another layer. In 2021, researchers found plantation records in North Carolina that documented approximately 140 Scottish prisoners from Culloden. But cross-referencing these names with British transportation records showed that 47 of them had no corresponding entry in any British official record. They were documented as arriving in North Carolina, but never documented as leaving Britain. It's as if they suddenly appeared in the colonies with no official record of transportation. The theories about what this means range from record-keeping incompetence to deliberate erasure. But the fact remains, there are significant gaps between the number of people transported and the number documented in both British and colonial records. Then there are the trial records. The British recorded approximately 120 formal trials of Jacobite rebels between 1746 and 1748. But in Scottish regional archives, there are records of approximately 180 to 200 executions from that same period. Some of those executions have no corresponding trial record in the official British documentation. This could mean several things. Maybe trials were held locally without formal British military records. Maybe some executions were summary. No formal trial, just execution orders. Maybe Scottish record keepers documented things that British commanders never formally reported. But the discrepancy is significant. It suggests that the official account is incomplete, that things happened in the Highlands after Culloden that weren't fully recorded in the centralized British military documentation. And given what we know about the Duke of Cumberland's authoritarian control and the unlimited authority given to occupation troops, it's not unreasonable to think that some of those unrecorded executions might have been irregular. By 1750, 4 years after Culloden, British Army records show approximately 3,000 soldiers stationed in Highland occupation forces. But by 1752, that number suddenly drops to approximately 500. Where did 2,500 soldiers go? The records say they were transferred to other postings. But there's a gap in the documentation. About 40 years of records where the movements of those soldiers are vague or incomplete. Why would the British Army lose track of 2,500 soldiers for 4 decades? That seems impossible for an organization known for meticulous record-keeping, unless those soldiers weren't actually transferred, unless they're included in casualty figures that were never officially released, unless something happened in the Highlands between 1746 and 1750 that required more casualties than anyone was willing to acknowledge. This is all speculation based on gaps and inconsistencies, but it's the kind of informed speculation that comes from looking at what the official records don't say, what they hide through omission, what they gloss over with vague language. The 2019 archaeological findings have reopened questions that historians thought were settled. The casualty numbers don't match up. The execution records are incomplete. The transportation documentation has gaps. The trial records don't align with Scottish execution records. Something about the official Culloden narrative isn't quite right. And every time historians dig deeper, literally dig into burial pits, figuratively dig through archives, they find more evidence that the story we've been told is incomplete. But the mysteries don't end with casualty counts and missing records. They extend into the months and years after the battle, into decisions that shaped not just Scotland, but the entire British Empire. Because Culloden wasn't an isolated military engagement, it was part of a larger strategy. And understanding that strategy means understanding why this single 90-minute battle changed the course of history. The British government's response to Culloden was the most systematic cultural suppression in modern British history. We've already talked about the Act of Proscription, the banning of Highland dress, the restrictions on Gaelic. But there was something else happening in the background, something more subtle and possibly more devastating. The British began a deliberate campaign to redefine what Scottish meant. Before 1746, Scottish identity was actually quite diverse. You had lowland merchants with a different culture from Highland warriors. You had Presbyterian clergy with different values from Catholic clans. You had urban merchants with completely different worldviews from rural farmers. Scotland wasn't monolithic. But after Culloden, the British government and Scottish collaborators started constructing a new narrative. They started portraying the Highlands as backward, savage, barbaric. They portrayed lowlanders as civilized, modern, progressive. This narrative justified military occupation and cultural suppression. If Highlanders were genuinely uncivilized, then bringing them into the British fold wasn't colonization, it was civilization. And here's the clever part. Some lowland Scottish elites agreed with this characterization. They saw economic opportunity. They saw modernization. They wanted to be part of the British commercial empire. So they collaborated with the suppression. They leased the land. They encouraged emigration. They helped erase the culture that their own ancestors had been part of. This is why the Highland clearances happened. It wasn't just economic displacement. It was cultural erasure with a profit motive. Landowners could make more money from sheep than from people. So people were removed, forcibly, over generations. Entire communities were depopulated, not because of famine or disease, but because sheep were more economically efficient than families. Between 1750 and 1850, approximately 100,000 Highlanders were displaced. Some of them left voluntarily. They could see there was no future in the Highlands. Most were forced. They were evicted from lands their families had occupied for centuries. They were forced into cities or forced to emigrate. The irony is brutal. Culloden was supposedly fought to maintain British sovereignty and prevent rebellion. But the aftermath of Culloden made the Highlands so intolerable to live in that massive emigration became inevitable. The British didn't have to forcibly exile Highlanders. They just had to make Highland life economically unviable. And that's exactly what they did. By 1900, the Highlands were dramatically depopulated. The clan system was extinct. Gaelic was nearly extinct. Highland culture was a memory. And the Highland people? They were scattered across North America, Australia, New Zealand, and the industrial cities of lowland Scotland and England. The question historians have been wrestling with for decades is, was this all deliberate? Was the British government and the Scottish collaborators executing a long-term strategy to destroy Highland culture? Or did it just happen to work out that way? The evidence suggests it was deliberate, at least to a degree. Internal British government documents from the period explicitly discuss the need to civilize the Highlands. The legislation was carefully designed to make traditional Highland life impossible. The military occupation was systematic. The recruitment of lowland collaborators was strategic, but it also wasn't completely planned. The speed of cultural change surprised even the people executing it. The willingness of Highlanders to emigrate was greater than expected. The profitability of sheep farming created market pressures that outpaced government policy. History, as always, is more chaotic than any grand strategy. Which brings us back to Culloden itself, and why understanding this battle matters beyond just military history. Culloden represents a moment when one system of social organization was replaced by another, when a kinship-based, honor-driven, clan-structured society was forcibly incorporated into a centralized, capitalist, bureaucratic empire.
It happened through violence, certainly. The battle itself was violent. The executions were violent. But the real violence was systemic. It was legal. It was economic. It was cultural. It was the kind of violence that doesn't leave obvious scars. It leaves demographic collapse and linguistic extinction and cultural amnesia. And the official records of this process are incomplete. The casualty counts are vague. The execution records have gaps. The transportation documentation doesn't match up. The trial records are scattered. The whole story is told through absences and inconsistencies in the historical record, which is why what we're finding in the ground matters so much. The mass burial pits, the skeletal evidence, the material artifacts that archaeologists are recovering. These things can't be rewritten in an office. They can't be sanitized or minimized or controlled. They're evidence of what actually happened, regardless of what the official records say. And what they seem to suggest is that the aftermath of Culloden was significantly more brutal, significantly more comprehensive, and significantly more thorough in its cultural destruction than the official histories have acknowledged. Which raises the question, if the official record is this incomplete about what happened after Culloden, what else might we be missing about the battle itself? The answer to that question might be sitting in burial pits and archival gaps and archaeological sites that haven't even been fully excavated yet. Because Culloden isn't finished telling its story. 4 centuries later, we're still finding pieces of it. And every piece changes the narrative just a little bit more.